G'day! Welcome to True Blue History. I'm Adam Blum. Today's special guest, it's a very special day actually, because I'm interviewing World War II veteran David Trist. And David saw action in Boganville and other parts of the Pacific during World War II. And David has joined us today to tell his story. It's an honour and a privilege to have him on True Blue History. Hi Dave, thanks for joining us on the show.
Thanks Alan, thank you.
So before you enlisted in the war and went off to fight in the Second World War, you enlisted in the Guinea Volunteer Defence Corps as an underage soldier, and many young Australians wouldn't be familiar with the Corps and others like it. Can you share with us what the Corps was and what was its responsibilities?
Yes, Adam. The VDC, or Volunteer Defence Corps, was suggested about 1937 by the RSL. The RSL, of course, would be returned soldiers from World War One, and they could see the deficiencies in Australia's armed forces. And for a number of years, they put up suggestions that their experience should be used in a force. The Commonwealth government at the time failed to take any notice of this. But the RSL went ahead and they made plans. They knew a war was about to break out, and they had some plans made, and they had loose formations of what they were going to do. When war broke out, the government realised that the VDC would be a useful thing, but they had no equipment to pass on to them. But a number of World War One generals were involved. For example, Sir Harry Chauvel, who led the historical cavalry charges in the Middle East battles in World War One, became the Inspector-in-Chief. Then we had Major General Gordon Bennett and Major General Sir John Gellibrand, who were responsible in each state for groups of ex-World War One people. And they set up these forces, part-time, weekend warriors, we could call them, and they trained them basically in commando-type activities, but to take over from the younger permanent army blokes on coastal defence and that sort of thing. So each state had one. Now, the war broke out in 1939, and a lot of the militia who had been working in the army or engaged in the army work between the two wars joined the AIF, and they went overseas. 4 divisions, let's say 100,000 troops, and it left a relatively small number of troops in Australia when the Japanese came in. But by this stage, the VDC had built up to about 50,000 troops, which was the equivalent of 2 to 3 divisions. So we had the 4 divisions, the 3rd, the 5th, the 10th and the 11th division in Australia, the 6, 7, 8 and 9 overseas, and the VDC suddenly became a major part of Australia's defence, in numbers anyhow. So it was quite an important segment of Australia's defence in World War II.
So what were some of your duties that you did in around Queanbeyan and Canberra?
Well, we had a sergeant major whose name I can't remember, but he had been in the British Army in World War One in the Guards, and he used to treat us as if we were in a British parade ground. And Saturday we used to dread a bit when this bloke would be drilling us or sending us out on a route march. And but however, the training that I got was particularly with the infantry work with hand grenades and that sort of thing proved invaluable later on when I joined the AIF when I became 18. There'd probably be 30 or 40 old blokes who were in their 40s, for ex-World War One, and I think I was the only underage fellow. And the old diggers, after a route march, for example, on a Sunday, one of our blokes owned a pub, Spenderlove, in Queanbeyan, and illegally we used to sneak in through the back door into the pub after the route march, and hoping the police didn't arrest us. But the old blokes used to say that I'd never become a man unless I could drink this green absinthe, I think it was, as they used to in France. And they poured this drink into me, and I was violently ill. So I've been off grog ever since. And that's when I was 16. But anyhow, we did a lot of route marches. We guarded a naval wireless station called Harmon, which is still in existence out at Canberra. And also the War Memorial was just being built, and one of our jobs was to set guard there at weekends. Apart from our training, we had these set guard jobs. We also did a lot of work with the Dutch Air Force. The Dutch had, it used to be the Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia. They were the colonial masters, and they flew medium bombers, and there was a squadron at Canberra who used to do coastal patrols in the 40s, anti-submarine patrol. But they were stationed at Queanbeyan. They took over one of the pubs, and these big blonde Dutchmen, the air crew, and the little Indonesian ground crew. And I got my first taste of how colonial masters treated the countries they were in. So the Dutch deserved to be driven out of Indonesia, I believe, as the French deserved to be driven out of Vietnam, and the British deserved to be driven out of India. And the colonial rulers, at least World War II, brought about a lot of changes in that regard.
Absolutely. And so your father, so you had your time in the Defence Corps, and then your father was a World War I veteran.
Yes.
Were there any other family members who served in that war, and how powerful did his service or their service influence you to want to enlist in World War II?
Well, World War One. My dad had a lot of books, and I used to love reading books about World War One. And he and his cousin joined up in World War One. My cousin Les Trist was one of the original pilots, and he, in fact, eventually became a pilot up in New Guinea in civilian life, and died in about 1932 in an air crash up there. So I had him to look up to, as well as my father, and this great number of books. But I went to a boarding school called Helston Agricultural College, which was a boys' boarding school, and a couple of hundred boys. And the headmaster was World War One veteran, and he drilled into all the boys the importance of that. Some of the staff, Curly Moyer, the foreman out in the farm, was a World War One bloke from Gallipoli, and we used to love listening to him talk. So all in all, my main worry was when the war broke out, I was a bit too young to join up straight away. It was going to be over before I had a chance to fight in it. So I was rather pleased when I was 18 and it was still going on.
Yeah, definitely. I think that was the thing in the First World War too. Most of the men who enlisted, Dave, were very keen and eager as well, and they were worried that the war was going to be over before they could do their bit. So you enlist in 1943.
43, I was 18.
Yep.
I remember I was working when I was 16, and I got on the train when I was accepted for the RAF. I went to Goulburn. More formalities, but I remember they sent me a letter that if I took certain material, they'd pay me for it. The toothbrush, I've still got the bit of paper. Toothbrush was threepence halfpenny, I think, and a knife and a fork, they gave a couple of pence each. So if you took some of your personal equipment, rather than having to issue to it, you got some money for it. Also took my civilian clothes in a suitcase, which as far as I know, I never got back. Somewhere the suitcase full of my clothes from that time. But I went from Goulburn down to the Sydney Showground, more enlistment procedures, sleeping on a palliasse, straw palliasse in the showground in the pig pavilion, and then to Cowra, for the 1st Recruit Training Battalion, and there were maybe 40 or 50 of us, and they lined us up after we got off the train and said, now, well, anybody with previous war experience, please step forward. About 3 of us stepped forward, and the other 2 blokes, well, where have you been, son? Oh, I was in Tobruk. I was over there when I was 14 or 15 or something, and they found out my age and they sent me back. Because they came to me and said, oh, I've been in the VDC for a couple of years. Oh, what's that? Anyhow, I explained it to them and they said, all right, well, you blokes don't need to go through this preliminary training. You can move on. So that meant we went more quickly and ended up after a relatively short period. The young soldiers were kept in the 18th Battalion down in Sydney. And it was just an excuse for cheap labour because we were used as wharf labourers. And they used to truck us down on an apron truck, a tray truck, which sit back to back with our feet. And our drivers used to try and race down Pacific Highway. And the wonder we didn't get thrown off and get killed was you get to the wharf. And, of course, we had to learn how to unload and load ammunition and that sort of thing, both in the harbour and on the wharf. And then a call came round, as we'll come to later, and they had to send a few people down to Cowra. And I was asked, or not asked, I was told I was going, along with maybe a dozen of my mates. We hopped in a train at Central, went through the night and arrived at Cowra at daybreak, and you could see out of the train the dreadful conditions at the POW camp because and some of the Japanese had put their heads on the railway line and were decapitated and all that sort of thing. So we helped round up the prisoners. By the way, we weren't allowed to carry arms. We had sidearms, a bayonet, but they wouldn't allow any of the young troops carry rifles because they didn't trust them. Although I was a marksman, I was paid extra because I was a good shot. I had to leave the rifle behind in Sydney. And then there was probably 400 or 500 Japanese survivors who were put on these trucks on at the back of which big cages had been put, and maybe 20 prisoners in a truck with a toilet, a little mobile toilet thing. And off we took in a great convoy, went all day out to the POW camp at Hay. And on the way, the Japs were recalcitrant a lot. They'd empty their toilet bins in the street of any little towns as we went out, showing a complete disregard for hygiene and et cetera, et cetera. So they were a cranky lot. The guards, like me, in the front seat, you open a little thing above your head, and you stuck your head out and kept an eye on the back of the prisoners in the back of the truck. No sealed roads, hot, dry weather, and dust unimaginable. This great plume of dust moving along with the convoy all day. We got to Hay Camp at dusk. The prisoners were herded out and put inside, and some VDC blokes were the guards, the olds and bowls as we call them, and they were looking after the POW camp. And they had interpreters, and they told these Japs the rules were pretty strict. There was a white line drawn inside the wire, and they must not cross that white line. And the Japs were gathering in groups and rushing towards the line, then stopping. And one poor bloke got pushed over and he got shot. So the guards were fair dinkum.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So how long were you involved in the Cowra and the Hay?
Well, that was probably a fortnight, I'd say. Yeah.
Yep.
And then I still can't remember how we got back to Sydney. It must have been by train. Hopped in a train and went back, and then they sent us up to Canungra, which was the jungle training camp, for a couple of weeks, 3 or 4 weeks. Very interesting camp. We were split up into sections of about 20 or 30 fellows, 2 or 3 tents each to put. and there was a creek. There were no ablution facilities. You had to go to there's a creek just below us, but you weren't allowed to wash there. You had to line up and run as a group about 4 or 5 miles, and then there was another part of the creek and say, right, you go and do your washing in there. Run back and you can have breakfast. So it's a pretty tough introduction to jungle training, but very effective. And then we got on a train, went up to Atherton Tablelands, right up the north coast of Queensland, the east coast of Queensland, and we were allocated to battalions, and I went to the 58th, 59th Battalion, to C Company, and then we were sent down to Townsville, hopped on a ship at the end of 1944 and went across to Boganville.
What was your first impressions of Bougainville and New Guinea when you arrived there?
Well, there's an American. In Torquay, in Bougainville, we took over from an American division. I think it was called the Americal Division, and the rumour had it that the Yanks, the Americans, went the rounds of their prisons, and if the prisoners volunteered to go in the army and not come home on leave until the war finished, they were allowed out of prison. So they're a pretty rough old lot. And we didn't like them very much, I must say, because they'd set themselves up in a luxurious way in this Torquay segment where they'd been for about 12 months. They had canteens, PXs, I think they called them, equipped like a department store. They had picture theatres, and we believed, the rumour went around that the Yanks used to occupy the front seats of the picture theatre, the open-air picture theatre, and their Japanese friends occupied the back seats because they didn't want to annoy each other. And then, rather than leave us the goodies from their canteens, they buried it. They dumped their jeeps and things into the ocean rather than leave them for us. And they weren't very popular with the Australians. I had my first Coca-Cola, but I found out where they'd buried stuff from one canteen and dug up a crate of Coca-Cola. And I can still remember that first sip of a nice, warm Coca-Cola drink. Didn't think much of it, actually.
No, I wouldn't think so, with especially being not warm, and Coca-Cola's not very nice when it's warm, that's for sure.
But I'd never struck Coca-Cola. I'd read a lot about it, and I thought, oh, this is pretty good.
So you're in New Guinea now, and by this stage of the war, and with the fighting being so close to home, what did you think were the top priorities for pushing the Japanese back and defending?
Well, of course, it looked as if the Japanese were able to invade Australia, but that had been stopped. And there's a fair bit of submarine activity, but again, our naval forces were, in 1944-45, ascended. Where we were in Bougainville, only a few Japanese planes, most of them have been shot down. They had a few over in New Britain, but basically we controlled the water and the air. They had a lot of troops in that area, the New Britain, Solomons, New Guinea area, probably 300,000 and 400,000 troops, and we didn't have that many. But we had better equipment and we were better led, and we were in the ascendancy. We'd been told that the invasion of Japan was the aim, and we'd been earmarked to go up to that invasion, our battalion, and fortunately that didn't occur. But we knew that we were on the ascendancy, but we also knew that the Japs weren't going to give in. Yeah.
Absolutely. And if you're comfortable to share it with us, Dave, what do you remember about your first time coming under enemy fire?
Well, mixed feelings a bit. Probably the one I remember most, it mightn't be exactly the first, but end of a day's patrol, company settled into a defensive position, dug a slit trench with my mate, Reg Turner, who was the second last bloke left. We had time to dig a sleeping bay just behind it. It was wet and raining, but in the trench I dug a little indentation on the side of the slit trench, and I put 4 grenades in there. Went back and lay down on the banana leaves in the sleeping bay, and I think we did the first shift, the first 2 hours, 6 to 8. So about 9 o'clock, woken up with hand grenades exploding all around us, and the Japs had snuck up and were attacking us. So I slithered out into the slit trench and grabbed hand grenades. You could see the line of a grenade coming in, the sparks coming towards you. So I threw back one and heard a few yells. I thought, good, that was a good shot. And then my mate Reg, who was behind me about 2 yards, started to fire his 303 straight over my head. And I said, cut that out, you might hit me. So eventually I threw 3 of the grenades, and it seemed to be going all right, and I pulled the pin out of the 4th grenade and dropped it, ready to throw. It was all quiet. And after about 10 minutes, I was feeling with my foot, see if I could find the pin for the grenade, and couldn't find it. And then hung onto this grenade in my hand, and I thought, blood, and I threw it out because the whole camp thought, hello, we're being attacked again. But it wasn't so. But anyhow, in the morning, at daylight, the Sergeant Major, Jiggy Walton, crept up and said, you blokes are lucky. As he went past the sleeping bay, there were 2 unexploded Jap grenades in where we were sleeping. And he said, come on, out the front, we'll go and see what happened out the front. So we went out the front and found a few dead Japs. So he said to me, after he went through their gear, he said, you killed them, you can bury them. So that was an introduction to...
Absolutely, an introduction in itself. That's just, wow.
So I thought I handled it okay. I was pretty confident in my ability with hand grenades, and I always reckoned I was a good cricketer and a good bowler, so I just built a hand grenade out to where I could see. You could see it coming in towards you in the night time with the sparks coming out of the grenade. They used to pack, the Jap grenades weren't as powerful as our Mills bombs, but they used to have little packets of nitric acid blocks, yellow acid that they'd pack on the outside of their grenades and throw it, except the problem was when they went off, this yellow stain went over everything. And I know that particular day, all our gear was yellow because there's so many grenades had gone off around. Yeah.
So most of your fighting was in Boganville, and
Yes.
what were conditions like when you were in Boganville, and what did you find most challenging in Boganville? And for Australians, what did they like least about the fighting in Boganville?
Well, South Boganville was a very boggy area, high rainfall. There was a narrow road, the Guion Road, going down. Guion was the southern naval base where the Japanese had very big concentration of forces. And we were moving down the island and following this Guion Road and developing it as we went along, what you call corduroying the muddy tracks, cutting down timber, laying them across the track to allow our supplies to be brought up by jeeps. So that was our axis of advance. But of course, there was probably 7 or 8 rivers that along the way with no bridges. And with all the rain, sometimes there'd be a 6 foot high, 6 foot deep torrent of water rushing down, so you couldn't cross it. But most times, 2 or 3 feet of water, and you'd send a couple of blokes across hoping they didn't get shot in the middle of the creek or river, and when they got the other side, the rest of you could move across and get across, and then off you'd go. So the battle of the rivers and the river fords were quite a big part of the campaign there. A lot of shelling. The Japs had a tremendous amount of artillery, and you could say almost World War One conditions, digging in, being shelled, and then patrolling out and gradually pushing them back all the time.
Very much jungle warfare.
Yes, a lot of patrolling. Sometimes I can remember one 3-day patrol where a company, we did a wide encircling movement, and pretty onerous to carry 3-day supply. Anyhow, yes, the jungle patrolling was a big part of your day's job. Usually, we tried to do 2 days patrolling, and the 3rd day was your rest day. Now, the rest day consisted, firstly, you had to do 2 yards of corduroying. So you had to cut down some trees, split it up, lay them on the road, which might take you 2 or 3 hours, in the rain, peg the logs down onto the road, and then you could go back and have your rest day.
Jeez, yeah, that...
and meanwhile, you just hoped there was no shelling going on. Yeah,
absolutely, absolutely. So, was there much assistance provided for Australian troops from the local people in Boganville?
We had some carriers, but the poor Boganvillians were absolutely overwhelmed by the Japanese forces, and most of them had gone bush. On the eastern side of Bougainville, there were a number of coast watchers who did very successfully, had groups of Bougainvillian natives used as commando forces, and they probably killed more Japanese than the Australians did. They were very successful, but I can remember groups of Bougainville natives, women, children, etc. You'd come across very occasionally in the jungles, and they were pleased to be fed and that sort of thing. But we also had a lot of New Guinean or Papuan carriers. We had a Papuan infantry battalion helping us, who were very good. But the Papuans were called by the Bougainvillians brownskins because they were much lighter skinned, and the Booker boys, the Boganvillians, were black as the ace of spades. And 2 different races, although they're all part of the Australian dependency of New Guinea. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Quite different races. Yeah.
So, for you, whilst you're in Papua New Guinea, you became very sick with jungle fungal infections and illness.
We all had it, and I didn't fully succumb till the war finished, but when you weren't able to change your clothes for weeks on end, and you're sleeping in wet clothes, and you kept your boots on when because you knew you had to get out into your trench, you didn't take your boots off, and your shoes were wet, and your feet got pulpy. So it was a real problem, the fungal disease. And hookworm was another one. We were treated for hookworm.
I'm just sitting here, Dave, just listening and just thinking it is just unbelievable that the conditions that you faced, and just for you and your fellow men in the battalions to just keep pushing through day by day, and I think today with today's generations, I don't think we could do what you did. I don't think
we were very ordinary Australians, and I'm sure you could. There were some in the unit who were outstanding, and went looking for, hunting for the Japanese. But most of us just went along as a group and took care as much as we could. But some of the times we had to do frontal attacks on dug-in positions, which exposed you to enemy fire pretty well. And I was thinking about one example. I'd been selected and given about 2 days training in the use of a compass, and I was called a member of the I section, and I was supposed to be able to read a map and lead patrols and that sort of thing, which eventually I did in some sort of way. But anyhow, this particular attack was on a pretty heavily defended position, and our company were lined up, two platoons up the front, and I was with the officer, Ted Griff, and we moved along and we were being held up a bit, and he sent me back. He said, you go back and bring the reserve section up, and they were supposed to be 100 yards behind. As I went back, I was called over by a bloke, and they'd just built a stretcher, and one poor fella had a leg nearly hanging off. And there were only 3 able blokes, and they were trying to manhandle this stretcher, and they said, hang on, you've got to get onto one arm of the stretcher. I said, no, I'm supposed to be going back to bring up the reserve platoon. Oh, no, anyhow, I said, all right, I'll give you a hand for a little while. So we went back, carried this stretcher back a bit, and there was no reserve platoon. So I thought, God, I'm disobeying orders here. So I worked my way back to Griff, and he said, oh, thanks for bringing it up. They must have heard what Griff had told me, because they weren't, and they'd come up anyhow, and I must have walked through them and found this wounded bloke and the group around this wounded bloke. And anyhow, so that's very clear in my mind. And years later, I thought this bloke who was wounded, his leg was just hanging, a bit of a leg, I mean, nasty wound. There's no way he's going to recover. You know. I was at a reunion about 30 years later, went down to Melbourne. I'm sitting beside this bloke, and I said, that's funny, I think that this is this bloke, I didn't think he survived. It turned out his leg healed. No, it didn't heal. They cut it off and they had it. But he said he got back all right, and they carted him back. So I said, I helped carry you back, mate.
So I'm thankful that he probably was thanking you and saying thank you for carrying me back and helping me.
Disobeying orders.
Yeah, absolutely. So after the Japanese surrender, where were you when you heard that the Japanese were surrendering?
The front, down South Bogan, the front was this big Mevo River. It was one of the biggest rivers down there. Very wide, but when it hadn't been raining very much, you could ford it, go across it. We had a number of patrols across the river, maybe 5 miles to go to Buin, and we're getting close. But the Japs were starting to get consolidated, and they were determined that they were going to make a big last stand around the Buin area. So this was basically the starting line for the final battle in Boganville. And of course, we had a tank with us, a Matilda tank. We had 3 or 4 tanks in the battalion, but in our company. And we used to get the tank and get your defensive position. We'd put them in the centre of the area that we were. And at the back of the tank, there were some speakers, and you could listen to their wireless. And they had the ability to pick up the ABC in Australia, and we used to listen to the news. You know, you sneak up to the tank and grab these ear things. What not speakers? And so we knew what was happening about the atom bomb being dropped, and then of course we knew when the war was over. But we'd been told when the war was over, in those next few days, just to be careful, no point in getting killed at this time. And but the Japs didn't really respond very well, and they kept attacking us. We had surrendered pamphlets that the Air Force were dropping all over the Jap lines, telling them to surrender, and the war was over. But we thought the main use of that paper were the natives were picking up and using it to roll tobacco, roll cigarettes. But I've got copies of the surrendered documents in these pamphlets that were dropped. They're in pidgin English and Japanese. Yeah.
So after the Japanese surrender, you were assisting in collecting the 250,000 POWs.
Probably through the Southwest Pacific. There's about 40-odd thousand, 30 to 40,000 left in Boganville. But then up in Nauru Island, which is just about 100 miles north of, and some of the other smaller islands, there were Japanese, and I had volunteered to join a little army boat which was escorting a landing craft to go up to Nauru, and that was one of the best trips I did. Overnight we got to Nauru, loaded up the Jap prisoners, maybe 200 of them on the landing craft, and then this little 38-foot launch. There were 4 Australians in the back. We each had a Bren gun, I remember, which fortunately we didn't need to use, and sailed back to an island further down called the Faroe, Fauro, Faroe Island, and there's probably 50 to 80,000 Japs there, and over the next month or so, Japanese ships had come down and picked them up, including an aircraft carrier, and take them back to Japan. And then what were left, just before Christmas in 1945, we took over to New Britain, to Rabaul, where there was still a couple of 100,000 prisoners. And by this time, my battalion had been wound up, and I'd been sent to the 3151 Battalion. So we were put in charge of a group of maybe 20,000 Japanese, build a big camp, or we supervised them building a big camp. Put them to work collecting ammunition and digging up unexploded bombs all around the place. And we didn't understand the environmental issues. We used to take all the ammunition a couple of miles out to sea, and they had to throw it in the ocean. Probably there's tons and tons of unexploded bombs, and etc., etc. Unfortunately, we didn't understand until one night the big dump of ammo. In this camp with, say, 20,000 Japanese, there's a little segment up the corner where the Australian Guards used to be, and we fenced ourselves in so that they couldn't attack us. And we used to have a Japanese batman come and polish our boots each morning and cook our meals. And if we went out into the camp, we just had to watch we didn't get our head knocked off, because they're far outnumbered. But anyhow, there's a big dump of unexploded ammunition waiting to be loaded on the landing barges to take out to the sea. And one bloke decided to commit harry-carry, and he set it off. And we were stuck in this camp for about 3 nights with this huge, lots of explosions going on. And the only way we got out, they drove a tank up, and we got on the the far side of the tank and snuck away from all this exploding ammo.
Unbelievable story, unbelievable. And so what was your feeling towards the Japanese, Dave, and what kind of physical condition were they in after the surrender?
Well, most of them were okay. They're similar condition to what we were. They were suffering from tropical diseases, etc., and certainly hadn't been fed as well as we were. But I've never overcome my dislike of them, and I don't think I ever will, because some of them, most of them are okay, no doubt, but there are some that were absolute animals, cruel animals, and I don't think I'll ever. I did have a connection with the Japanese not so long ago, a couple of years ago. I brought back with me a large banner. Before we put the Japs into the POW camps, we searched them for dangerous things, of course, which meant that we knocked off anything we thought was useful. But searching this bloke's gear, we'd line them up on the beach, for example, before we marched them into the POW camp. And they'd step back and leave their gear, and we'd search it. And this big banner, about 6 or 8 foot long, covered with Japanese characters. And I thought, this has got to be propaganda, I'll take that. And So I had it for years and years, looked after it well. Didn't ever have it interpreted until one time I had it interpreted, and turned out it was the religion, a Shinto religion that came from a shrine near the international airport at Tokyo. And this Shinto shrine had been knocked over during the war and rebuilt, and was now a tourist place. You can see it on the computer. And the mayor of Penrith was going up on a sister city thing, so he took it, sent warning that he was bringing up this particular object, and sent pictures of it up. And the head priest met him, and they'd built a wooden cabinet and said it's the only banner that they'd ever got back. You know, it was one of their pre-war banners, a very important one. And he gave, in return for me giving the banner, he sent down some cigarettes. And the cigarettes, which I've got in there in the box, Peace brand.
Oh, right.
Now, the story with that is a different story to the banner. One stage, a small patrol, about 4 or 5 of us, were out in the jungle, getting dark, and we couldn't get back to our camp. And we captured a Japanese man, a lot of shelling, and this shell-shocked Japanese bloke, he was pretty harmless. We grabbed him, and the corporal in charge of the patrol said, right, well, we better form a bit of a defensive position in the jungle. 2 there, Trist, you and the Jap, and the third one. You look after him during the night. So I wasn't quite sure what to do with this bloke, but I did have some signal wire with me. So I don't know if it was allowed under the Geneva Convention, but I bound him up pretty well with this signal wire and laid him on the bottom of the trench and stood on him. And he turned out to be not a bad sort of a bloke, because during the night, I didn't sleep, he'd ask me for a cigarette, and I used to give him cigarettes. And we'd cover that so that no glare went out. And in the morning, we were attacked. And so there's just this very small defensive position. And I thought, hang on, I'll get this bloke to yell out to his mates to surrender. I still remember this foolish action. So I gabbled away to him in pidgin English, which he seemed. I said, you call out a long Japan man to surrender. And he stood up and he gabbled away, oi, 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 they used to say. Always start with oi, oi, and yabba, 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 yabba. And the firing stopped. I thought, beauty. And then after a couple of minutes, they were firing at us from the back. He'd told them to work their way around the back. We were all looking out this way. And like in the pictures, one of our patrols turned up. So I handed over this bloke, this Japanese, to my mate who was on the patrol that came up. And I said, now give him, he likes to smoke, give him some. So he handed over, he claims, my mate Jack Payton, a tin of tobacco. So when this banner business came up, I told the story to the head priest who I happened to meet, the Shinto priest, who came down to Australia. And that's why I got the packet of cigarettes in exchange for the tobacco that had been handed over. It's a long story, but all connected.
It's amazing to hear stories like that. It's just fascinating. So thank you for sharing it. What's your feeling about the leadership that the men you served under and the men you led as well?
We had excellent leadership. Our general of the 5 infantry brigades that were in Boganville, General Stan Savage, had been in World War One, and he, in fact, was one of the founders of Legacy, which I've been in for 50 or 60 years, Stan Savage, and he wrote the most interesting article in our battalion association magazine after the war, a message from Uncle, we used to call him Uncle Stan, and he told us how we were the equal of any that he fought, even at Gallipoli. So he liked us, and we liked him. Then we had another bloke called Hammer, He got the nickname of Tack Hammer. he was the brigadier, very good. And our colonels, George Wharf was one, and he was a wonderful soldier. And you worked your way down. The officers were good. Many of them had been promoted from the non-commissioned officers to commissioned rank during the war, and they were down to earth and led the troops well. So our leadership, I thought, was excellent.
Absolutely. So after the war, how difficult did you find it adjusting back to civilian life?
I had worked in the Commonwealth Bank for 2 years at Guinea. While we were away, the Commonwealth Bank, which was a government institution at the time, made up our pay. We used to get a letter every now and then saying you've got a salary rise when you're out in the middle of the jungle somewhere. And they put the surplus, the difference between the army pay and the bank pay, into a bank account. So when I got back, I had over 100 quid in this bank account, which was big money in those days. In fact, it was enough. When I got married, I think I had 200 quid, and it was enough to buy the furniture for a house. I bought a dining room suite and a bedroom suite, and a few other things, for this 200 quid. I had enough to set up a house. And of course, when we got back, we went through the bank ran courses, which were conducted by ex-servicemen. And for maybe 6 weeks we went to these classes and brought back into civilian life that way, and then sent out to various bank branches. Yeah.
Looking back, what's your proudest moment of the war?
Well, I don't think I was proud about the war at all. I was pleased that it was over. I think at the time I was thinking about the next war because, it seemed to be never ending, and probably it was the wrong thing to do, but I thought, how do I make sure that I have enough points to get an early discharge from the next war? When the World War II finished, a point system came in. If you were married, you got a lot of extra points. And I think if you had more than 100 points, your age and your service and your marriage came in. They amalgamated by some formula. If you had over 100 points, you went back to Australia. I was single, hadn't been in the army more than a couple of years, and I had about 90 points. So I did another 12 months up in the islands. So I thought, now, if the next war come, the best thing for me to do is to get married. I'm going to get double points. That was an adjustment that I made, and I was sent out here to St Mary's in the Commonwealth Bank to open a branch of the bank. And one day a fellow came up, whom I'd got to know, one of the customers, and he said, I believe you're looking for board. Up to then I'd been boarding in a boarding house, about 8 of us in the one room, and wasn't very... Oh yeah, I said, I would like to board. He said, well, there's room at our place. So I go down, who'd put him up to it was my wife, who was the daughter, his young daughter. So I go down and I marry the landlady's daughter, and that's 71 years ago now.
Amazing story.
She conned her father into going and telling this young bank teller that there's a good accommodation at our place.
Well, it's 71 years still going strong. So
yeah, still going strong.
Absolutely. Looking back, and if you're willing to share with us, what is the memory that you find most difficult after all these years?
Well, I often think about my old mate Titch Henshaw, which I told you a bit about earlier.
Yep.
And Titch, when we went to Boganville, we were firstly put into tents in the base. There were 8 of us in a tent, and Titch was in there. He'd served at Salamoa. He was 2 or 3 years older than me, maybe 2 years older. And at night time we used to talk to each other, and he said he was disappointed in the way he'd served and the attack on Bob Dewey Ridge, that he felt he hadn't done the right thing. And he was determined that he would do better next time. So off we go, and we're down in South Boganville on a patrol, and we got ambushed. And obviously a very strong force, machine guns and heaven knows what. and got down, and Titch put his head up and he got shot through the head from where we're lying in the jungle after the ambush. We couldn't get to him because of the heavy fire, and we went back to get support. Went back after some time, and his body wasn't there. And about a month later, we'd moved further south down towards towards where we were going, and got a message to go back to identify an Australian body in the jungle that they'd found. And I went back, and it was Titch, but he was surrounded by dead Japanese. And he'd crawled away. He hadn't been killed, obviously. He'd crawled away from that position with his own gun, and the Japs went after him, and he shot them before they killed him. Yeah. So he made up for what he believed hadn't been a good action in New Guinea at Salamoa by this very heroic action, which has never been recognised. But a lot of that obviously went on, and so I often think about Titch and how he used in the night time back in the base camp, how he used to deride himself for not performing as well as he should have in that first action there.
It's an unbelievable story, and it's stories like that give me an interest in. It's the personal stories, Dave, your story, and the stories of the men and women who have gone before you as well. And yeah, thank you for sharing that one. It's a real.
If I could, I've been asked sometimes to make a presentation on Anzac Days.
Yeah, please.
And a couple of years ago, as a subject, I decided to investigate missing, believed killed. More than 20,000 troops from World War I are still in that category, and of course we have a place called the Unknown Soldier at the War Memorial.
Yep.
In recognition of these people, not only soldiers but airmen and sailors whose bodies have never been recovered, and their relatives, of course, would get a telegram saying that he's missing,
yep,
believed killed, and they've never been satisfied. So this little story I picked up somewhere and recorded. I'd just like to read it to you, if I may.
Absolutely, Dave, please.
The Unknown Soldier. I crouched in a shallow trench on that hell of an exposed beach at Gallipoli, with the steeply rising foothills bare of cover, a landscape pockmarked with war's inevitable litter, piles of stores, equipment, ammunition, and the weird contortions of death, sculptured in Australian flesh. I saw the going down of the sun on that first day of 25th of April 1915. I fought in the frozen mud of the Somme, in a blazing destroyer exploding in the North Sea. I fought in the perimeter at Tobruk. I crashed in the flaming wreckage of a fighter plane in New Guinea. I lived with the damned in a place cursed with the name of Changi. I was your mate, the kid across the street, the medical student at graduation, the mechanic in a corner garage, the baker who delivered your bread, the bank johnny who counted your money box. I was an army private, a navy commander, an air force pilot. No man knows me, no name marks my tomb, for I am every Australian serviceman and servicewoman. I am the Unknown Soldier. I died for a cause I held just in the service of my land, that you and yours may stay in freedom. I am proud to be an Australian.
That's a pretty special poem, Dave. That is, I'm nearly crying hearing that. They're very powerful words, and yeah, all I can say from the younger generation to you and people who have gone before you, Dave, is thank you for your service. Thank you so much. You've given us the freedom today that we enjoy. So thank you.
Thank you, Adam.
It's something that sometimes is overlooked, and obviously last year, Dave, due to COVID-19, people weren't. It leads me into speaking to you about this. Is people weren't able to attend Anzac Day as they had traditionally done for many years previously. How do you feel when you saw people being creative and diversifying new ways of honouring those who served? How did that make you feel?
Well, I've never been one for commemoration and regimentation. It doesn't worry me. And probably the main, to answer in a different way, I'm more inclined to think of the people that are not here. And I've always been taken with one of Bob Dylan's songs, "Where Have All the Flowers Gone?" And I often think, now there was 700 or 800 blokes in our battalion. It was like a big family, and where have they all gone? And if you know Bob Dylan's song, "Where Have All the Flowers Gone?" I don't know whether you know that one.
I don't know that one, but
it expresses my thoughts very well. They say, "Where have all the soldiers gone?" And when long time passing, where have all the soldiers gone long time ago? Where have all the soldiers gone? Gone to graveyards, every one. Oh, will they ever learn? When will they ever learn? So they express, why do we want wars?
Exactly.
And they all have all gone, yeah.
Exactly.
So there's only a couple of us left in New South Wales from our battalion, and my mate. I was secretary of the Battalion Association for. In fact, instead of just the battalion, the 3 battalions were the 15th Brigade. I was the secretary of the 15th Brigade Association for many years, and one of my jobs was to keep in touch with the 200 or 300 people who came from New South Wales. And as far as I know, there's only 2 of us left. So that is a bit unnerving at times. And I'd like to show you some of the records I've got in there.
Absolutely, that'd be that'd be fantastic, and it's the reason why, Dave, it's so important to get your thoughts on your experiences through the war, and that's why oral history is so. I believe it still is a very vital key to history, and I thank you for coming on and sharing your experiences of your war service. And in closing, what are your thoughts that you'd like to share about the war, and how would you like people to remember?
Well, I'm a pacifist now. The only thoughts I'd like to share is don't have another war. That's just as simple as that. Absolutely.
There's, as you would say, and you've seen firsthand, Dave, that no one wins a war. There's no victors in war.
That's right.
So, on that note, Dave, I'd like to thank you for sharing your story and making the time to share with us on True Blue History, and all I can say is thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast.